Why are there so many English translations of the Bible?
Let's put that to the test.
This is Prove All Things, a podcast where we test everything so that we can hold fast to what is good and abstain from what is evil.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. We're discussing the many different English translations of the Bible that exist today, and there may be a question among some, are all of them reliable? Do we need all of these different English translations? And we have to admit, I think, our limitations. If we don't know the original Greek language, we don't know the original Hebrew languages, we have to rely on what others tell us when it comes to the translations that we read in our Bibles today. So, what do we make out of all of them? Because we've got some English translations that go back several hundred years. We've got some that are much more modern. What's the difference in them all? What do we make of all the different styles? What do we think about all of them?
I've got two bits of information here, and I don't know which is accurate. I heard that there are over 100 different English versions of the Bible or translations of the Bible. I've read something else that said they were over 70. So I don't know, somewhere between 70 and over 100.
Right.
And as you mentioned, I think the passing of time has created some of these because the English language is a changing language. And if you take a translation that is several hundred years old, well, you're looking at words that have changed and mean something different today. So for that reason, someone would come along and say, hey, we need to update this a little bit and use some different wording here. So that's one reason why there are so many English translations that have been created. It's just simply the passing of time has necessitated a change in words.
It was safe to say that the King James Version is the oldest English translation that most people are probably familiar with today. And there's a lot. If you just, and many of you may be readers of the King James Version, that's fine. But when you're reading, you're going to encounter lots of different words that are just not used in our language today. So there is some value in having a translation that maybe supplies the newer understanding of a word. I think one of them, as you mentioned, I suffer the little children to come to me. Well, that doesn't really make sense the way that we would read it. Peradventure is a word that appears in there, and I think it's a word that really just kind of means maybe. So a lot of our more modern translations are just supplying the newer word that we might use, and that's understandable.
Right.
Yeah, and some translations in the King James Version would require a little bit, maybe even more, words that really mean differently than how we've used them. So, for example, in 1 Thessalonians 4:15, you made mention, we will not prevent those who have fallen asleep. That same word is used in an Old Testament passage. We prevent the rising sun. Well, the idea is not that we'll keep them from doing it, but that we won't precede them.
Yes.
And so it's maybe we don't even use that word in the same way at all now, and we have to define that word anyway. And that's what a translation is doing.
Yeah, so what happens is somebody's going along and they realize, every time I get to this passage, I have to explain what this means. Right. And why don't we just have another translation where we put the explanation and use a word that already means that today? Or
so that would be one explanation for more modern translations. They just reflect the more modern usage of words so that we're not curious as to every time we come across a word.
And something else, the passing of time has given us some more opportunities. Additional manuscripts have been found over the last few hundred years. Extra biblical writings, more extra biblical sources have come available that help us to maybe fine-tune the meaning of different words and so forth. And so that's going to change some too. As you get some additional manuscripts that have been found that are maybe older than the manuscripts that you had before, and maybe that sheds a little light on something that a new translation would help clarify.
Yeah, and you just think about what was available in 1611 for the King James Version. And a lot of what we're going to say maybe in comparison to the King James Version. I don't think we're trying to disparage the King James in any way. People we know and love and appreciate use the King James, and it was an incredible translation at the time, and it's still a very good one. But there are some differences, and so that's what we're kind of trying to address. But if you think about the textual Greek basis or even the Hebrew that was available at the time of the King James, I mean, over 400, nearly 500 years, lots have changed. Lots of things have changed as far as what was available. And so maybe we can just have a little bit more precision. But that also explains sometimes you'll be reading maybe in Bible class or hearing a sermon, and a preacher will kind of pass over a passage that you were reading along, and then he kind of skips a verse, or maybe there's a phrase that's not in there. The reason that is because of the different manuscripts that are being used. And, there's some questions about what passages should be included and which ones shouldn't, but no Bible doctrine is at stake in some of those questionable passages. It's just a matter of, is this a repeated phrase from somewhere else? Is this something that a scribe kind of transposed in there on accident? That's the kind of questions that people are trying to figure out. It's not a question of, is this true or false necessarily, because most of the passages, I don't think any of the passages that are in question kind of subvert some Bible doctrine.
Yeah, and the questions that, sometimes the questions that are being addressed by some of these versions are questions that we may not even be aware of. And so, there's some value perhaps to kind of doing a little bit of study into what was motivating scholars to perhaps try to produce a revision, and what kind of things and evidences in the manuscripts were they relying on. We talk about a lot of times King James version, some of the newer ones, because the King James is kind of the oldest and kind of the standard for English translations, but it continues to rely on the same family of manuscripts even still today. Whereas some of our, maybe our newer English versions like the New American Standard or the English Standard Version, they kind of rely on what we would kind of maybe call a more critical text, where it's taking in, and giving some consideration to, the broad spectrum of manuscripts that we have, and making certain decisions based on, sometimes it's a majority reading, sometimes it's an older reading. And, there's a need to kind of do some research into that. And we may research all that and still keep using the version that we use. I use the New King James Version, which is essentially just, it's using the same text as the King James, but it's kind of, it's taken out some of those archaic pronouns and things like that. And so we may do all that research and still end up using the same version, but then we have maybe some idea about what was motivating scholars. And then we feel like that there may be a place for different translations, and we also feel like, hey, there's some value to comparing these. If I have a question about something in the King James or the New King James, then going over to a version that might be using a broader text for its basis, Greek text and Hebrew text, then that may show me something and help me. I do that a lot, and I wonder if we don't do that so much now, so naturally, because these versions have been around so long, that we don't even realize that this has benefited us, that having these different versions has benefited us. It's just become such a habit and a custom where, I look at these two, and looking at the two readings together, kind of arrange in my mind, I feel like I understand what this is saying.
Well, kind of along one of the points that you just made, we need to first understand that translations are the work of men, which means they are subject to error, and they are all subject to interpretation. We'll talk about that maybe more in just a minute when we talk about the different kinds of translations, whether they're more word for word, more literal, or maybe more of a paraphrase. But I think it's good that there are lots of different translations, because in a sense that maybe adds a little bit of accountability. And so we can measure one against the other, and I think that probably helps us a little bit.
Well, there are some denominations, religious groups, that have created their own translation. Well, the fact that we have so many English translations provides a good defense against things like that, because you've got 100 translations and no translation communicated this truth in the way that your denomination thinks it needs to be translated. So you've got to create your own translation. Well, that just kind of shows how maybe misguided the doctrine is, if there's no translation that renders it that way. And then something else is, here we've got a translation that renders this same word or this same verse in various different ways in various Bible studies that we're a part of. Sometimes we come across a verse and the New American Standard says this, and the English Standard says this, and the New King James says something even different. Well, what do? Well, that's a good place to kind of dig in and study and work through those texts, and maybe even try to go back as best we can to the original languages. But for the most part, I couldn't put a percentage on it, but the vast majority of places, there's not a question between the translations, which gives us more confidence to be able to say this must be an accurate reflection of what the original language is actually said.
Yeah, I think like the ESV, what they would say, that's a translation that I think came out in 2001. Obviously, that's a lot of difference than a translation that first came out in 1611. But what they would say is this translation is from the latest, strongest textual foundation yet. But that does not mean that the King James Version is unreliable. So while we have maybe a lot more information, we've got some tools, as Lonnie mentioned, that help us understand the original languages, that does not mean that the ones previous to what we have now are unreliable. It just might mean that there are some advantages this translation offers that were not available to us previously.
All right, so another aspect besides the manuscripts and maybe the different family of manuscripts that different English translations come from, you also have the problem that you would face anytime you translate from one language to another. And that is, how literal do you want to be in the translation of it? For any of our listeners that may know Spanish, you'll notice that the way that things are worded in Spanish is different than the word order in English. One of the most common phrases you learn is, me llamo Lonnie. And we would translate that, my name is Lonnie, but that's not a very literal translation of that. An exact literal translation of that would be, me, I call Lonnie. Well, that doesn't flow in English, so we switch that around to where it flows in English to convey the same idea, and that is, my name is Lonnie. Well, translators of the Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic have to decide how to take that language and the way that that language is worded and put it into something that's understandable in English. What complicates that just a little bit regarding the Scripture is we hold that this word is inspired. And so how much liberty do you take in taking something that you feel like the word is inspired, and then we want to translate it into something that's understandable in English? So you have different schools of thought in this. One is we want to translate it as literal as possible, word for word, because we don't want to lose anything. On the other hand, you have those that look at it and say, yeah, but if you translate exactly word for word, it doesn't flow in English, or sometimes it doesn't even make sense in English because of different things. So there's a spectrum of thought of how to do this in a way that holds the accuracy of the wording and yet also makes it understandable.
Readability.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, every English translation, unless it's an interlinear, which is just translating the literal Greek word, like the New American Standard, the English Standard Version, New King James, all of which call themselves word-for-word translations, all of them require a little bit of what they call a dynamic equivalence. What they're trying to match the sense of what's being said, at least to an extent. My favorite illustration of this is from 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 13, where the literal Greek text, which is translated pretty literally in the New King James Version, for example, says, therefore, girding up the loins of your mind. Well, what does it mean to gird up the loins of your mind? And we could explain that it was the idea of kind of tying up your robe in order to be able to get to work. Well, the English Standard and the New American Standard takes that idea of girding up the loins and kind of explains what that phrase means, and so it renders it, therefore, preparing your minds for action. Well, which one's accurate? Well, they're both accurate in different ways, right? One of them is literally accurate in that it gives us the words, and the other one is accurate in the sense that it's giving us the sense of what it means. The Message, which is really not a translation, it takes the English text and then kind of summarizes it, paraphrases it.
So it's all the way on the other end.
It's all the way on the other side.
Spectrum.
So Eugene Peterson, who wrote the Message translation, is not. I think he probably was familiar with original languages, but he's mostly just looking at the English text and working from that to his paraphrase. So what you've got then is the Message then says, roll up the sleeves, get your mind in gear. Well, that's a kind of an idiomatic, a cultural way of saying gird up the loins. But you have three different ways of rendering that, all of which I think get to the idea of what's being said, but they do so in different ways based on different philosophies of how to approach that verse. And yet New King James, ESV, and New American Standard would all fall into the same category of literal word-for-word translation.
But even within that, they still have some different ideas.
That's right.
Because, like you mentioned, all of the three that you just mentioned, they would claim that they are literal word for word, but even within that, they have taken more maybe like the dynamic liberty.
That's right. And I'll just say one other thing about this. No English translation, no reliable English translation, maybe I should say it that way, is trying to slip something through in translation and push an agenda so that you kind of, you don't know the original languages, but we're going to kind of trick you into what it means. I like this in verse 13, preparing your minds for action, and mine has a footnote in the ESV that says, the Greek says, girding up the loins of your mind. Right? It's very transparent. The whole process is transparent. We can look at the philosophy. Most English Bibles have an introduction that explains what the translators were thinking and why they made certain decisions about certain words. The process is so apparent that we can get on Bible software and look at an English translation and see the Greek word behind it. It's not as if this is some mystical, magical process. It's just a process that requires hard work and sometimes requires making decisions that there's not really a clear black and white answer, but we're trying to do the best we can with.
And illustrations, metaphors, idioms, they can be powerful. Mm-hmm. If the people that you're talking to understand them.
Right.
And I tell you what, even today, Lonnie, I don't know if you've tried to ever found yourself trying to use an idiom in the Czech Republic, but I found myself, I'm talking to people who understand English, but I use an American idiom, and I immediately know. I see heads turning this way. That doesn't, because I'm speaking in English, but I'm using an idiom that, fits into my culture, and so you have to, so they can be powerful, but the point of what's going on here is so you've got maybe some Greek idioms of the first century, but they need to be kind of, put in some setting for people today who are speaking English.
Which means we're not only trusting those scholars to give us the literal words, but we are, in a sense, trusting their interpretation too.
Sure.
And so while we might caution against a tremendous interpretation that's way far on one end of the scale, we, even in the most literal translations, we trust them to give us some interpretation within the translation.
Yeah, and I don't guess I would say that I have a particular problem with somebody taking the English text and trying to summarize that in a way that's helpful to understand. I think that's a pretty useful thing to do. It's what we do in preaching to some extent in Bible class teaching. What I would caution against is using that as the basis Bible translation that we use in study. I think the closer that we can get, not knowing the original languages, the closer that we can get to the words that God gave us, the better. And then we start with our conclusions from that, not farther down the road where we've taken somebody else's conclusions and then we have to draw conclusions from that, and pretty soon we're pretty far down the road. We want to get as close as we can, and that's something that translations help us do.
All right, so in kind of summary of this idea, if we're looking for something that's closer to the word for word but still understandable, what are some recommendations that you guys would make on that?
I typically study out of the New American Standard, and its goal is to adhere pretty close to the literal, but of course it has some interpretation in it as well that makes it readable.
Yeah, I use the ESV, and I would say that if there was some way for me to get a parallel Bible that had the New American Standard, the New King James, and the English Standard all together, I'd get it. But they're from different publishers, and that they don't produce that. But maybe one day they'll work together and they'll do that. And that's what something like that I think would be a good, if you want to be a careful Bible student, get, and I think we also might recommend the King James Version as,
I use the New King James.
Yeah. So you put those 4 or 5 translations together, compare those to each other, and I think that's fine. And any one of those as your main translation would probably, we'd recommend.
Yeah, and read the introduction of your English version, whatever it is. That is a good start for you to kind of, they talk about this process, and I think as you listen to them, read what they're saying about this process, you will, I mean, if we're just, taking them at their word, you will get some sense that their goal was to avoid bias. That was their goal. So that's a good goal. Can we all avoid bias completely? No, but then that's where, comparing different, versions and translations, I guess version would be the more accurate word perhaps, but comparing different versions can help us. Start there, reading that introduction, and it's just kind of, it is really mind-blowing to realize how much work goes into producing an English version.
Yeah.
And that's where that accountability comes in too, to kind of prevent all that bias.
So just for our listeners' sake, so we on one end of the spectrum, we're looking at more literal, the versions or the translations that we discussed just then would fall in that spectrum. Then you have that kind of more moderate where you're trying to take the thought and convey it into an English thought. And probably the most popular translation that would fall in this category would probably be the NIV.
Or the Holman Christian is now
Okay.
kind of, they pride themselves, I think, on being right there, kind of in the middle of.
And they're not
you know,
they're not bad translations,
Yeah.
but they're very honest with the fact that they are going for more thought thought.
And it may be a little bit easier to read,
That's right.
but you do lose some of the literal understanding of what's been translated. And then we talked about this more paraphrase. You mentioned the Message.
Yeah.
What are some other that would fall in this? The Good News.
The Living Bible.
The Living
I think
Bible,
is
yeah.
a pretty common one. I've seen.
And with these, really what you have is you have the author that is just saying, here's my understanding, here's my interpretation of what's there. And this probably has the greatest risk. It's interesting to look at and read or whatever, and I'm not saying there's no profit from it, but you're really looking at whoever the translator is, you're looking at their thoughts about it rather than what the original text said.
Can we make a couple of book recommendations before we go?
Sure.
The first one, Neil Lightfoot's book, How We Got the Bible. That's going to be more about the textual basis of the translations than it really will be about the translation itself, about the history of how we came to have an English Bible. It's a good book if you've got somebody who has questions like, can we trust that we have what the apostles wrote down? That's a good little resource for that. And another book would be Ron Daly has written a book called Principles, a Perspective on Bible Translations, And he just answers questions like, why do we need translations? And how can I know if my translation is accurate? And it's a pretty simple, non-technical approach to it that's been helpful to me anyway.
He may have answered those questions a lot better
He
than
may
we did.
have, and so
Yeah.
if you want more insight on that, then you just and he would be somebody who would be. I think he has started maybe working on a translation of his own, so he's somebody who's much more well versed in the Greek aspects of that. So it might be a good resource for you to look at.
Okay. All right. Thank you for listening. If there are questions you have, we'll be glad to entertain those. If there are topics that you would like to hear a discussion about, let us know. You can find us on Facebook or reach us via email, proveallthings@mail.com. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to Prove All Things. To suggest a topic, raise a question, or offer a comment, write to proveallthings@mail.com.
Okay, ready?
Ready.
Hold on. Give me a second.
Why are
Give me a second. I'm sitting here like playing with my ears.
He gave you plenty of warning.
Why are there so many translations of the? Oh man, that's sorry.
Does.
Hey, where are we at? Like time wise?
It is 8:53.
All right.
We have squandered away an hour.
Well, there's some of that time was wasted. Yes.
But that's not new. So,
But not as much time as sometimes.
Sure. Yeah.
thank you for listening to our podcast. Today we're. Oh, I did so good too.
Man, that was a great start. Oh, listen to the sound of that.
It's so gold.
I didn't get thank you. I was nervous
okay.
that you start laughing. At
I
me
was
anymore,
too, so-
I gave you a quick point,
Yeah.
and then we missed.
Now, if I mess up this next time, it's on you. Okay.